They told us 1984 would be a dystopia. They told us Big Brother was watching. And if you listen to the financial analysts, they told us the video game industry was already dead, buried in a landfill in New Mexico alongside millions of unsold Atari cartridges. But they were wrong. While North America was mourning the crash of 1983, a quiet revolution was taking place in garages, bedrooms, and laboratories. 1984 wasn't the end. It was the year the medium grew up. It was the year we stopped just shooting aliens and started building universes. From the birth of the Macintosh to the invention of the open world, this is the story of one of the most pivotal years in computing history. The home computer war was messy. If you wanted to play games in 1984, you needed a computer, a power brick, a cassette player, endless RCA cables, and, most dangerously, you needed to hijack the family television. Enter Alan Sugar. While Commodore and Sinclair were fighting over specs, Amstrad realized the real battle was convenience. In April 1984, they dropped the CPC 464. The color personal computer was a masterclass in marketing. You didn't just buy a computer, you bought a workstation. You opened the box, took out the machine, plugged it into its own included monitor, and that was it. One plug for the wall. No stealing the TV from Dad. It was an all-in-one before Apple made it cool. It even had the data recorder, the cassette player, built right into the dashboard. But what was going on under the hood? So, spec-wise, it was a bit of a Frankenstein, but a beautiful one. It ran on the Zilog Z80A processor at 4 MHz. That's the same heart as the ZX Spectrum, but faster. It shipped with 64 kilobytes of RAM standard, which put it right toe-to-toe with the Commodore 64. But where the Commodore 64 was famous for its muted, earthy tones, the Amstrad was loud. Oh, it was vivid.
Here's a small demo of how it sounded.
The GPU was based on the Motorola 6845. It gave you a palette of 27 colors. The games looked like arcade ports, bright reds, electric blues, neon greens. It didn't have hardware sprites, which made smooth scrolling tricky for developers, but if you just looked at a screenshot, the Amstrad often looked the best. And the sound? Distinctive too. It used the AY3812 sound chip. It wasn't quite the Mozart that the Commodore SID chip was, but it was capable of 3-channel stereo sound that defined the European gaming childhood. It had some funny regional quirks, too. In Germany, it was sold as the Schneider and had boring gray keys to look like a serious business machine. And in Spain, they released a version with 72 kilobytes of RAM. But get this, the extra 8 kilobytes wasn't connected to anything. It was literally a dummy chip soldered to the board just to bypass a Spanish tax law on computers with 64K or less RAM. It also wasn't expensive, as it was aiming to conquer the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum market share. For just £359, you were getting a computer, a cassette player, and a monitor. Thing you had to buy with other computers or hijack the family television. It may not have conquered America, but in Europe, the Amstrad CPC was a titan. It proved that in 1984, you didn't just need power, you needed a machine that actually fit into your life.
If you rewound the clock to early January 1984, using a computer felt like specialized labor. You stared at a black screen with glowing green text, memorizing cryptic commands like CD, copy, MD, RD, and many others. It was abstract, unforgiving, and strictly for the initiated. Then came the Super Bowl. Ridley Scott directed a commercial that promised 1984 wouldn't be like 1984. 2 days later, Steve Jobs pulled a beige box out of a bag, and the computer actually spoke. The Macintosh had arrived. Visually, it was unlike anything else on the shelf. While the IBM PC was a sprawling industrial beast and the Commodore 64 was a keyboard breadbox, the Mac was a vertical all-in-one appliance. It took up the space of a piece of paper on your desk. It even had a handle built into the top, not because it was truly portable, but because Steve Jobs wanted you to feel comfortable touching it. But the real revolution happened when you turned it on. There was no command prompt. Instead, there was a desktop. You have to understand how alien this was. For the first time, you didn't type del or erase, you grabbed a picture of a file and dragged it into a picture of a trash can. The mouse, which was a bizarre, expensive peripheral before this, became the primary way you interacted with the machine. It changed the psychology of computing from coding to pointing. Under the hood, it was powered by the Motorola 68000 processor running at roughly 8 MHz. This was a massive leap forward. While everyone else was still messing around with 8-bit chips like the 6502 or Z80, the Mac was rocking a 1632-bit architecture. It was raw power, but it was power used for a specific purpose, to drive that bitmap display. The screen was small, only 9 inches, but it was crisp. It had a resolution of 512 by 342 pixels. It was strictly black and white, no grays, no greens. This binary contrast allowed for something revolutionary: typography. For the first time, the font you saw on the screen looked like the font that came out of the printer. It was the birth of desktop publishing. However, the Macintosh of 1984 had a fatal flaw, and it was a big one. It was severely malnourished. It shipped with only 128 kilobytes of RAM, and unlike the Commodore or IBM PC, the Mac's operating system was heavy. It chewed up so much memory just drawing the windows and icons that there was almost nothing left for the actual software. It also lacked a hard drive. It relied on the new 3.5-inch Sony floppy disks. They were harder and more durable than the old 5.25 floppy floppies, but because the Mac only had one drive and very little RAM, you had to perform the disk-swapping disco. To copy a file, you sometimes had to eject and insert disks dozens of times in a row. It was maddening. And then there was the price. $24.95. Or about $7,500 adjusted for inflation today. For a computer with a black and white screen and no hard drive, it was an astronomical ask. Yet despite the price and the memory limits, it succeeded in doing something the other machines couldn't. It made the computer an appliance for artists, writers, and dreamers rather than just engineers. It wasn't the most practical purchase of 1984, but it was undoubtedly the most influential.
In 1984, IBM was the undisputed king of the high-rise office. If you wore a suit and tie, you used an IBM PC. But Big Blue wasn't satisfied with just owning the boardroom. They wanted the living room, too. They saw Commodores selling millions of units to kids and families, and they wanted a piece of that pie. So amidst immense hype and a marketing campaign featuring a Charlie Chaplin look-alike, they unleashed the IBM PC Jr. Internally, they called it the Peanut. On paper, this machine should have been a slam dunk. It was effectively a real IBM PC, but shrunk down for the home. It ran the same Intel 8088 processor as its big brother, but in some ways, it was actually better. It had superior graphics capabilities, offering more colors than the standard Office PC, and a dedicated sound chip that could play 3 voices at once. It even had cartridge slots on the front, just like a video game console. Sierra Online even launched the legendary King's Quest specifically to show off what this little machine could do. The star of the show was the new 320 by 200 pixel mode. On a standard PC, this resolution only gave you 4 colors. On the PC Junior, it gave you 16 simultaneous colors from the full palette. This was the sweet spot for gaming. It meant that for the first time, an IBM computer could display graphics that actually rivaled the Commodore 64.
When you booted up King's Quest, the trees were actually green, the water was blue, and the walls were gray. It also offered a high-resolution mode, 640 by 200, with 4 colors. This was a massive upgrade for text and detailed charts, which were previously stuck in monochrome at that sharpness. But, like everything with the PC Junior, there was a hidden cost. This graphics system didn't have its own dedicated video memory. Instead, it carved out a chunk of the computer's main system RAM, up to 32 kilobytes of it. This was an architecture called Unified Memory Architecture. While it saved money, it choked the system. The CPU often had to wait its turn to access memory while the video chip was drawing the screen, making the PC Junior significantly slower than a standard PC, even when running the exact same processor. But the PC Junior is not remembered for its graphics or its sound. It is remembered for one of the most disastrous hardware decisions in the history of computing: the keyboard. In an attempt to be futuristic, IBM made the keyboard wireless, using infrared technology like a TV remote. This sounded great, but in practice, it was a nightmare. If you had a glass of juice on your desk blocking the beam, the computer stopped typing. If the batteries died, you were dead in the water. Worse than the wireless tech were the keys themselves. They weren't proper typewriter keys. They were small, rectangular rubber buttons that looked like Chiclets gum. They had no tactile feedback, large gaps between them, and were impossible to type on quickly. Users hated them instantly. It felt like a toy, not an IBM. Then there was the issue of expansion. If you wanted to add more memory or a parallel port, you didn't open the case. You bought sidecars, plastic modules that snapped onto the side of the computer. If you added enough upgrades, your computer started to look like a long, ugly plastic train stretching across your desk. And finally, there was the price. A fully tricked-out PC Junior model could cost over $1,200. In 1984, you could buy a Commodore 64 for about $200. Parents looked at the two machines, saw the IBM cost 6 times as much, but had the worst keyboard, and walked away. IBM tried to save it. They eventually offered to swap the terrible chiclet keyboards for real ones for free. But the reputation was already shattered. The PC Junior was pulled from the market in 1985. It stands today as a fascinating lesson. You can have the best brand name in the world, but if your product feels cheap and costs a fortune, you will lose.
In other IBM news, if August 1984 had a sound, it was the heavy industrial thud of the IBM PC AT landing on a mahogany desk. While the Macintosh was trying to be your creative friend and the PC Junior was trying and failing to be your playmate, the IBM PC AT, which stood for Advanced Technology, arrived to remind everyone that computing was serious business. This wasn't just a computer, it was a fortress. It was physically massive, taking up a huge footprint on the desk. And right on the front, it had a feature that perfectly summarized the corporate ethos of the 80s, a tubular steel lock. You actually needed a physical key to unlock the keyboard. It was a clear signal. This machine contains data worth stealing. Inside that steel case, IBM introduced the engine that would drive the next generation of software, the Intel 80286. The 286 was a beast. Running at 6 MHz, it didn't sound much faster than the older chips on paper, but it was a true 16-bit processor with a 16-bit data bus. It could move data around twice as fast as the original IBM PC. It introduced protected mode, a feature that theoretically allowed for multitasking and better memory management, even if the software of 1984 wasn't quite ready to use it yet. But the real game changer was storage. Before the AT, a hard drive was a luxury add-on that sat outside your computer in a separate box. The AT normalized the internal hard drive. It came with a 20 megabyte drive standard in the high-end model. In 1984, 20 megabytes felt infinite. You could install the operating system, the spreadsheet, the word processor, and the database, and still have room for years of work. You never had to hunt for a boot disk again. If you bought the massive IBM PC AT in August 1984, you couldn't just run the old software. The new hardware was too advanced. The disk drives were too dense. You needed a new operating system to bridge the gap. That was MS-DOS 3.0. It launched strictly as a companion to the AT, and its main job was storage management. Before this, remember, floppy disks held 360 kilobytes. MS-DOS 3.0 unlocked the AT's high-density drives, allowing for 1.2 megabytes on a single disk. For the first time, you could fit the operating system, your word processor, and your document all on one floppy without swapping. It also had to tackle the hard drive. With the AT shipping with a massive 20 megabyte drive, the old file system was struggling to keep up. MS-DOS 3.0 began the transition to a more robust file allocation system, what we would later call FAT16, allowing the computer to address these giant drives without chopping them up into tiny, unusable partitions. But the coolest trick for power users was the virtual disk. The 286 processor supported memory above 1 megabyte, but DOS couldn't actually run programs there. So DOS 3.0 included a utility called vDisk. It let you turn that extra RAM into a fake, ultra-fast hard drive. If you copied your software into the RAM disk, it loaded instantly. It felt like magic. However, there was a catch. DOS 3.0 was a rush job. IBM needed it on shelves to sell the AT, and it showed. It was notoriously buggy and unstable, particularly with the networking features they were trying to implement. It was so rough that many users skipped it entirely, waiting for the much more polished DOS 3.1 just a few months later. It was a necessary bridge to the future, but one you wanted to cross as quickly as possible. But the AT's most lasting legacy was its skeleton. It introduced the 16-bit ISA bus, the slots inside the computer where you plugged in graphics cards and sound cards. This architecture was so robust that the industry kept using it well into the late 1990s. If you built a PC in 1995, it probably still had a slot compatible with the 1984 IBM AT. Speaking of graphics cards, IBM PC AT released the EGA, the Enhanced Graphics Adapter. This was the moment the PC finally progressed. It offered a resolution of 640 by 350. That doesn't sound like much today, but in 1984 it was razor sharp. And more importantly, it gave you 16 simultaneous colors chosen from a palette of 64. You might ask, hey Tassos, if IBM made the graphics for its computers, what about the current market leaders? Well, ATI, which was bought by AMD in 2006, actually didn't exist yet. It wouldn't be formed in a year, and the first graphics card they launched was ATI Wonder in 1986, which we will see in more detail. And of course, NVIDIA wouldn't be formed for almost another decade. Of course, being on the bleeding edge was painful. The initial run of 20 megabyte hard drives had a failure rate so high it became a scandal. And the price was eye-watering. A fully equipped setup could easily run past $6,000, over $18,000 today. But despite the cost and the bugs, the AT was the definitive turning point. The Macintosh might have invented the modern interface, but the IBM PC AT invented the modern machine. Every desktop tower PC you have ever seen since is in some way a direct descendant of that beige tank from August 1984.
If you walked down the toy aisle in North America in 1984, the video game section wasn't just shrinking, it was being liquidated. The great video game crash of 1983 wasn't over. 1984 was the year the body was actually getting cold. The numbers were catastrophic. In 1983, the console industry generated over $3 billion. By the end of 1984, that number had plummeted to $800 million. That is a drop of nearly 75% compared to the previous year. It wasn't a recession, it was an extinction event. Retailers felt burned. They were stuck with warehouses full of unsold Atari cartridges, low-quality games that nobody wanted, famously dumped into landfills. The phrase video game became toxic. Analysts declared it a passing fad, like the hula hoop or the pet rock. This environment is exactly what fueled the explosion of the home computer. Parents still wanted to buy technology, but they weren't going to buy a toy that would rot in a bargain bin. They wanted something with value. So Commodore and Apple changed the narrative. They marketed the Commodore 64 and the Apple II not as game machines, but as educational tools. They told parents, if you buy a console, your kid plays games. If you buy a computer, your kid learns the future. It worked. 1984 was the year gaming moved from the living room rug to the bedroom desk. Because of this, 1984 was a strange, silent void for consoles. The ColecoVision was dying, the Mattel Intellivision was dead, the Atari 2600 was being sold for scraps. Meanwhile, in Japan, Nintendo was sitting on a gold mine called the Famicom. They spent 1984 desperately trying to find a distributor to bring it to America. They even approached Atari to release it for them, but the deal fell apart. Retailers told Nintendo that video games are over. This forced Nintendo to go back to the drawing board and redesign their machine to look like a VCR and include a plastic robot, just to trick stores into stocking it the following year. So 1984 was the year the arcade came home, but it came home on floppy disks, not cartridges. It was the year gaming grew up, put out a keyboard, and pretended to be homework. What about the arcades, though? If 1982 was the party, 1984 was the headache. The golden age of the arcade was officially dead. Revenue had been sliced in half in just 2 years, from about $8 billion to $4. The casual players, the moms, the businessmen had stopped coming. The arcade was becoming a clubhouse for the hardcore. The biggest casualty of 1984 was the Laserdisc fad. In '83, games like Dragon's Lair looked like the future because they played actual cartoons. But by 1984, operators realized these machines were a nightmare. The Laserdisc players were fragile, they broke constantly, and the games were expensive. 50 cents a play when kids only had quarters. In 1984, the Laserdisc bubble popped. Desperate to get players back, manufacturers tried to invent new visuals. In June, Atari released iRobot. iRobot is the most important failure in arcade history. It was the first commercial game to use filled 3D polygons. No sprites, real 3D math. It was effectively the great-grandfather of Super Mario 64 running on hardware from 1984. But it was too weird. Nobody played it. It flopped so hard that Atari reportedly dumped the unsold cabinets into the ocean. But while the high-tech experiments failed, a new genre was being born in the back corner. In December, a game called Kung Fu Master arrived. This was the pivot. Before 1984, you mostly played for high scores in a single-screen loop, like Donkey Kong or Galaga. Kung Fu Master changed the psychology. You weren't chasing a score, you were fighting through a level. It was the birth of the beat-em-up. It laid the groundwork for Double Dragon and Final Fight. 1984 also gave us the dual-monitor boxing of Punch-Out and the trackball physics of Marble Madness. The games were getting better, deeper, and harder. And that was the story of 1984. The Pac-Man fever was gone. The casuals left. What remained were the dedicated gamers. The industry was smaller, leaner, and darker. It wasn't about eating pellets anymore. It was about kicking punchers and navigating 3D mazes. The arcade wasn't dead, but it had definitely lost its innocence.
While the arcade industry was turning its back on Laserdisc technology in 1984, Data East decided to double down. They released Cobra Command, a game that tried to bridge the gap between the video arcade and the movie theater. Visually, it humiliated every other game in the room. While 1942 was using tiny pixel planes to simulate war, Cobra Command was playing a high-octane, feature-length anime movie. You piloted the LX-3 Super Cobra, a futuristic helicopter, on a mission to destroy a terrorist organization. You flew through canyons, city streets, and enemy bases that were drawn by professional animation studios, not programmers. The technology was a magic trick. It superimposed simple computer graphics, your crosshairs and the explosions, over pre-recorded video footage. It gave the illusion that you were controlling a cartoon. When you banked left, the video cut to a shot of the helicopter turning left. It felt seamless and incredibly expensive. It was developed by Yoshihisa Kishimoto, the same designer who would later create Double Dragon. He wanted to create an interactive movie before the term really existed. The audio was booming, featuring recorded voice acting and a cinematic score that drowned out the beeps of the neighboring machines. But it suffered from the curse of the format. It was barely a game. It was a memorization test. You didn't really fly the helicopter, you just reacted to prompts. If you missed a cue, the Laserdisc skipped to a death scene. If you succeeded, you watched the next clip. It was a beautiful, hollow experience. Cobra Command stands today as a stunning fossil, a glimpse of a future where games looked like cartoons, released exactly as the industry was deciding that graphics weren't enough. In 1984, video games were flat. They were about jumping over barrels, shooting aliens in a fixed grid, or eating pellets in a maze. The screen was a stage, and you were an actor with a very limited script. Then came September, and two students from Cambridge decided to put the entire universe inside a BBC Micro. The game was called Elite, and logically, it shouldn't have existed. The computer had roughly 32 kilobytes of memory. A map of a single galaxy, let alone a universe, should have taken up more storage than existed in the entire world at the time. But David Braben and Ian Bell didn't store the map, they used mathematics. They utilized something called procedural generation. They wrote a seed algorithm, a mathematical formula that generated solar systems on the fly as you flew toward them. It was a magic trick. The game contained 8 galaxies and over 4,000 unique planets, each with its own economy and government. And the entire code fit into less memory than a single standard email sent today. Visually, it was stark. It used 3D wireframe graphics, but with a crucial innovation called hidden line removal. Before this, 3D games looked like transparent glass wireframes where you could see the back of your own ship through the front. Elite felt solid. When you saw a Cobra Mk3 space station rotating in the void, it looked like a physical object. But the real revolution was the freedom. There was no boss to beat, no princess to save. You started with 100 credits and a cargo hold full of food. You could be a lawful trader, buying low and selling high. You could be a miner. Or you could buy a pulse laser and become a pirate. You were just a guy trying to survive in a cold, capitalist galaxy. The only metric that mattered was your combat rating. You started as harmless. If you survived long enough, killed enough pirates, and traded enough goods, you might eventually see that legendary word flash on your screen. Elite. It was the birth of the sandbox genre. It proved that a game didn't need a linear story to be compelling. It just needed a world. Every modern open-world game, from Grand Theft Auto to No Man's Sky, traces its DNA back to that 22-kilobyte cassette tape from 1984.
At the time, every other game in the arcade was built using sprites, flat pre-drawn stamps moving around a screen. iRobot was different. It didn't use drawings, it used pure math. It was the first commercial arcade game to feature filled 3D polygons. Not the see-through wireframes you saw in Battlezone or Star Wars, but solid, shaded geometric shapes. It was the great-grandfather of every 3D game we play today. The premise was bizarre. You played as Unhappy Interface Robot number 1984, a servant machine trying to rebel against a giant floating Orwellian eye called Big Brother. The gameplay was a mix of a shooter and a platformer. You had to run across a 3D grid, jumping over gaps and changing the color of the tiles to red to weaken the eye's shield. But the catch was the camera. If you jumped, the camera swooped and panned with you. In 1984, moving a camera in 3D space was technically impossible. Yet here it was, running at a smooth frame rate. It also featured something unheard of in an arcade, a doodle mode. If you got tired of the game, you could enter Doodle City, a sandbox mode where you could just use the polygons to make abstract art. Imagine that, putting a quarter into a machine not to win, but to paint with math for 3 minutes. But the world wasn't ready. The hardware required to crunch those numbers was incredibly expensive, making the cabinet cost a fortune for arcade operators. And the players? They were confused. It was too abstract,
too cerebral and too weird compared to the simple joy of Punch-Out. It was a catastrophic commercial failure. Only about 1,500 units were ever made. Legend has it that hundreds of unsold machines were shipped to Japan, stripped for parts, or simply dumped into the ocean. iRobot died a lonely death in 1984, but it proved that the future of gaming wasn't flat. It was solid. In June 1984, while American arcades were struggling, Namco released a game in Japan that would fundamentally change how role-playing games were played. It was called The Tower of Drugaya. Designed by Masanobu Endo, the creator of Xavius, it looked deceptively simple. You played as a knight named Gilgamesh in gold armor, navigating a top-down maze to rescue a maiden from a demon. It looked like a slower fantasy version of Pac-Man. But beneath the surface, it was arguably the most sadistic game ever made. The game had 60 floors. To pass a floor, you just needed to find a key and open the door. Simple, right? But to actually beat the game, you needed to find the hidden treasure chest on every single floor to upgrade your stats. And this is where the madness began. The game gave you absolutely no clue how to reveal these chests. On the first floor, the solution was logical. Kill 3 green slimes. But as you climbed, the requirements became deranged. On floor 26, you had to block a wizard's spell with your shield exactly 3 times. On floor 59, you had to defeat a specific enemy in a specific corner. On another floor, you simply had to press the start button. If you missed a single item, like the jet boots on floor 2, your character moved too slowly to survive the later levels. If you missed the red necklace, you couldn't see the exit. The game was essentially unwinnable if you didn't know the secrets before you even put your coin in. In America, this design was a disaster. Players felt cheated and the machine was a flop. But in Japan, it created a phenomenon. It turned the arcade into a community think tank. Players left notebooks on top of the machines, writing down the secrets they had discovered for the next person. It was the first wiki before the internet existed. This social cooperation turned the Tower of Drugaya into a massive hit. It laid the blueprint for the action RPG. The idea of a hero collecting items to permanently upgrade their sword, shield, and health directly inspired the development of The Legend of Zelda 2 years later. It was a game that hated you, but in 1984 Japan, everyone loved it back.
In August 1984, Namco did the unthinkable. They took the most famous video game character in the world, pulled him out of his maze, and gave him legs. This was Pac-Land. For 4 years, Pac-Man had been a yellow circle trapped in a dark neon box. But in Pac-Land, he was suddenly walking through a bright, colorful world. He wore a fedora. He had a nose. He looked like he walked straight out of the Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning cartoon, which is exactly what Namco was trying to emulate. Mechanically, it was a radical departure. There were no pellets to eat and no corners to turn. The goal was simply to get from the left side of the screen to the right. It was one of the very first side-scrolling platformers. You journeyed through towns, forests, and deserts to return a lost ferry to fairyland. And then you had to fly all the way back home. Technically, it was a showpiece. It introduced something called parallax scrolling. This meant the mountains in the background moved slower than the trees in the foreground, creating a sense of depth and speed that felt incredibly advanced for 1984. But the most jarring change was the controls. If you walked up to a Pac-Land cabinet, there was no joystick. Instead, there were 3 big buttons, one to run left, one to run right, and one to jump. To run faster, you had to physically tap the button faster. It turned the game into a physical workout. And while it's often forgotten today, Pac-Land is one of the most important blueprints in history. Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, famously cited it as a major influence. When you look at the bright blue skies, the hidden secrets, and the physics of the jumps in Pac-Land, you are looking at the DNA that would eventually become Super Mario Bros. Just 1 year later. Pac-Man may have started the maze craze, but in 1984, he taught the industry how to scroll. In December 1984, a young company named Capcom decided to stop making small ripples and finally make a splash. Their weapon of choice was a vertical shooter called 1942. Before this game, arcade shooters were almost exclusively set in space. You shot aliens, bugs, or spaceships. 1942 brought the war down to Earth. It was set in the Pacific theater of World War II. You piloted an American P-38 Lightning, flying over oceans and jungles, dogfighting against recognizable Japanese Zeros and bombers. There was a fascinating irony at the heart of this game. It was made by a Japanese developer, designed by the legendary Yoshiki Okamoto, yet the goal of the game was to destroy the Japanese Air Force and eventually bomb Tokyo. It was a calculated business move. Capcom wanted to break into the American market, so they built a game specifically to stroke the American ego. Mechanically, it refined the genre. It introduced the roll button. If you got overwhelmed by enemy bullets, you could hit a button to perform a loop-de-loop, making you invincible for a split second. It was the first panic button in gaming, adding a layer of strategy to the chaos. It also standardized the power-up system. When you shot down a specific formation of red planes, they dropped a POW icon. Collecting it gave you quad guns or 2 little wingman planes that flew by your side. It was simple, satisfying, and addictive. The sound design was unforgettable. It didn't have a driving soundtrack. Instead, it opened with a Morse code beep and a military whistle. During gameplay, the sound was dominated by the rhythmic drum roll of your machine guns and the screech of diving planes. 1942 was a massive success. It was the game that put Capcom on the map, transforming them from a minor player into an arcade giant. It established the template for the vertical scrolling shooter that would dominate the rest of the decade. If you played a shooter in the late 80s, it probably owed its life to that P-38 Lightning. In the middle of 1984, while the rest of the arcade was deafening players with explosions and laser blasts, Atari released something strangely quiet and architectural. It was called Marble Madness. It was the brainchild of Mark Cerny, a 20-year-old prodigy who would go on to design the PlayStation 4 and 5 decades later. While other designers were obsessed with destruction, Cerny was obsessed with physics. He drew inspiration from the impossible geometry of M.C. Escher and miniature golf to create a race against gravity itself. Visually, it was startling. It was the debut title for the Atari System 1 hardware, which allowed for a crisp, isometric 3D perspective. It abandoned the black, starry backgrounds of the era for clean, bright, grid-lined structures. It didn't look like a video game. It looked like a futuristic blueprint come to life. But the soul of the machine was the controller. There was no joystick and no buttons. There was only a heavy motorized trackball. This wasn't a gimmick. It was essential. You had to physically roll the ball to build up momentum. You could feel the weight of the marble. If you spun it too fast, you careened off the edge. If you went too slow, the marble munchers would eat you. It created a tactile connection that made the player feel like they were actually touching the game world. It was also an auditory milestone. It was one of the very first arcade cabinets to feature true stereo sound. As your marble rolled from the left side of the screen to the right, the sound physically traveled between the speakers, immersing you in the abstract world. The music was minimalist and eerie, shifting in tempo to match your panic as the timer ticked down. The game was notoriously short. A skilled player could finish all 6 levels in under 5 minutes. But those 5 minutes were pure stress. Marble Madness proved that you didn't need enemies or guns to create intensity. You just needed a ball, a hill,
and the cruel laws of physics. While the arcades of America were screaming with neon graphics and stereo sound, the most addictive video game in history was being born in silence, deep behind the Iron Curtain. On June 6, 1984, in the Dornitsyn Computing Center in Moscow, a researcher named Alexei Pajitnov was staring at an Electronica 60. It was a primitive Soviet clone of an American workstation. It had no sound card. It had no graphics capability. It could only display green text on a black screen. Pajitnov wasn't trying to make a product. He was just testing the capabilities of the new hardware and amusing himself. He remembered a childhood puzzle game called Pentaminos, where you had to fit 5-block shapes into a box. He decided to code a digital version. But he ran into a problem. 5-block shapes were too complicated to rotate quickly in real time, so he simplified them to 4 blocks. Tetraminos. You might think that Tetris looked like this, or like this, but because the computer had no graphics, it was monochrome, and he couldn't draw squares. Instead, he used a pair of text brackets to represent the blocks. On the screen, the pieces didn't look like solid objects. They looked like ghostly outlines of code falling down the screen. Originally, the game ended when the screen filled up. Pajitnov found this boring, so he added one line of code that changed everything. If a row was completely filled, it vanished. The effect was hypnotic. The moment he finished the prototype, he couldn't stop playing it. He realized he had created a virulent piece of software. It started spreading through the office. Colleagues would copy it on the floppy disks and pass it to friends at other institutes. Before it ever made a dime or saw a Game Boy, Tetris conquered Moscow strictly by word of mouth. In 1984, it was the only game that truly transcended technology. It didn't need a GPU, it didn't need a coin slot, and it didn't need a marketing budget. It just needed distinct shapes, gravity, and the universal human desire to create order out of chaos.
In January 1984, the Japanese gaming market was an island. While they were the undisputed kings of arcade action, they had almost no concept of the role-playing game. Western hits like Wizardry and Ultima were too dense, too English, and too ugly for the average Japanese gamer. Enter Hank Rogers. He was a Dutch-American living in Tokyo who saw a massive gap in the market. He realized that Japan had a love for fantasy. Dungeons and Dragons was a niche hobby, but they needed a bridge to cross the language barrier. His answer was the Black Onyx. Released for the NEC PC AT, it was a dungeon crawler stripped down to its absolute essentials. You built a party of 5 heroes with distinct colored hair and descended into a labyrinth to find the legendary Black Onyx to break a curse. Visually, it was a revelation compared to the wireframe skeletons of the Western games. The Black Onyx used solid, filled colors. The walls looked solid. The monsters actually looked like monsters. It introduced a visual vocabulary that is standard today, like the colored bar under a character's face that slowly drained from blue to red as they took damage. But initially, it was a disaster. Retailers didn't understand it. They asked, "Where is the reflex test? How do you win?" Rogers had to physically go to the electronics stores in Akihabara, stand by the computer, and pull customers in off the street to demonstrate the game. He had to personally teach an entire country how to play a turn-based game. His persistence worked. The game slowly gained momentum and eventually became the best-selling computer game in Japan for the year. Its impact is impossible to overstate. It educated a generation on concepts like hit points, experience levels, and turn-based combat. Without the Black Onyx laying this foundation in 1984, there would likely be no Dragon Quest and no Final Fantasy. It was the seed that grew the entire JRPG empire.
In December 1984, a Japanese developer named TNE Soft released a game that polarized the world. It was called Hydlide. While the Tower of Jiraga trapped you in a building and Dragon Slayer stuck you in a dungeon, Hydlide did something breathtaking. It opened the door and let you walk outside. It was arguably the first true open-world action RPG. There were no levels to select. You were dropped into a sprawling, scrolling map of fairyland with a sword and 0 instructions. You could walk anywhere: the fields, the graveyard, the vampire's mansion. It was a level of freedom that was almost paralyzing. It introduced a mechanic that is now standard in almost every modern shooter: regenerating health. If you got hurt, you didn't look for a potion. You simply found a safe spot, stood perfectly still, and watched your life bar tick back up as you took damage. It turned the game into a tactical rhythm of fighting and resting. The combat was raw bump warfare. You slammed your body into slimes and knights. But unlike its rivals, Hydlide allowed you to switch between attack and defense modes, forcing you to balance your aggression against your vulnerability. History has been unkind to Hydlide. When it eventually reached America years later on the NES, it was mocked for its repetitive, looped music and clunky movement. It was compared unfavorably to The Legend of Zelda. But this criticism ignores the timeline. Hydlide came out 2 years before Zelda. When Shigeru Miyamoto was designing Hyrule, he was looking at Hydlide. It was the rough draft of the open-world adventure, proving that a virtual world could be more than just a corridor. It could be a landscape.
Before Night Lore, video games on the ZX Spectrum were strictly two-dimensional. You moved left, right, up, or down. Night Lore shattered that last ceiling. It introduced a proprietary engine called Filmation. It presented the world in a solid, isometric 3D perspective. For the first time, objects had volume. You could jump on top of a table, or you could walk behind it and disappear from view. It gave the game a sense of physical space and architecture that was simply mind-blowing for a computer with less processing power than a pocket calculator. The story behind its release is legendary. The developers actually finished Night Lore in early 1984. However, they realized it was so advanced that it would make their other game, Saber Wolf, look archaic by comparison. So, they sat on it. They deliberately held back the most advanced game in the world for months just to let the market catch up. When it finally landed in November, it was a masterpiece of atmosphere. You played as Saberman, an adventurer cursed to transform into a werewolf. The game featured a real-time day and night cycle. When the sun went down, your character would agonizingly spasm and morph into a wolf, changing your jump physics and hitbox instantly. The goal was to navigate a castle of 128 rooms, solving spatial puzzles to find ingredients for a cure. It was punishingly difficult. One misstep and you would fall onto a bed of spikes or be crushed by a falling spiked ball. Visually, it was stark. To avoid the ZX Spectrum's famous color clash glitch, the game was rendered almost entirely in 2 colors. But this limitation made it look like a technical drawing come to life. It was moody, gothic, and precise. Night Lore didn't just sell copies, it forced an entire industry to pivot. Within weeks of its release, every other developer in the UK was frantically trying to clone the Filmation style. It marked the moment when British gaming moved from simple arcade clones to complex spatial adventures.
In 1984, IBM had a problem. They had built the PC Junior, a computer with advanced graphics capabilities, but they had no software to show it off. So they handed a suitcase of money to a company called Sierra Online and asked for a miracle. The result was King's Quest. Before this game, adventure games were like reading a book. You stared at static pictures and typed text. King's Quest was a cartoon. You controlled Sir Graham, and for the first time, you didn't just look at the world, you walked through it. The game follows Sir Graham, a knight tasked by the dying King Edward of Daventry to recover 3 magical artifacts: a mirror, a shield, and a chest. If successful, Graham inherits the throne. The world is designed to wrap around infinitely due to a magical law of containment, meaning if you walk far enough in one direction, you return to where you started. The breakthrough was simulated 3D. Graham could walk in front of a rock, or he could walk behind it and disappear. It sounds trivial now, but in 1984, this illusion of depth was technical sorcery. It turned the monitor into a window. It was also the debut of the 16-color palette. While other PC games were stuck in hideous cyan and magenta, King's Quest had lush greens, deep blues, and bright yellows. It was the first time a computer game actually looked like a storybook. But it was quite heavy, requiring 128K of RAM, huge for the time, and drawing the vector graphics slowly on screen. Designed by Roberta Williams, it relied on a text parser. You moved with arrows, but you interacted by typing. Open door. Bow to king. Take walnut. It demanded you think like a fairy tale character. If you met a gnome, you had to guess his name. If you saw a goat, you had to figure out how to use it to kill a troll. Ironically, the game initially failed because the PC Junior was a flop. But when Sierra ported it to the standard Tandy and IBM PC, it exploded. It didn't just save the company. It invented the modern graphic adventure. Every point-and-click game, from Monkey Island to The Walking Dead, owes its existence to Sir Graham's first walk in the woods.
In July 1984, arcades were loud, but they were mostly solitary. You played against a machine. Data East changed the social dynamic forever with Karate Champ. It is arguably the first true fighting game. Before Ryu and Ken, there were just Player 1 in white and Player 2 in red. It established the one-on-one versus format that would eventually create the competitive esports scene. The control scheme was bafflingly complex. There were no buttons. Instead, the cabinet had 2 joysticks for each player. One stick controlled your movement, and the other controlled your attack. By combining different directions on the 2 sticks, you could execute dozens of moves: sweeps, roundhouse kicks, flying side kicks. It felt less like a video game and more like learning an instrument. It wasn't a street fight, it was a sport. It featured a digital referee who shouted "fight" and "winner" using synthesized speech. Matches were decided by points, half points and full points, mimicking real competitive karate. It was precise. A single well-timed hit could end the round instantly. And then there was the bull. In the game's most famous bonus round, the game stopped pretending to be a sport and asked you to stand still while a wild bull charged at you. You had one chance to punch it in the nose. If you missed, you were trampled. Karate Champ popularized the side-view one-on-one fighter. Without this dual joystick experiment in 1984, the DNA for Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and Tekken simply wouldn't exist.
In 1984, there were a lot more games than the ones we looked closely at. While we don't have the time to view all of them with the same detail, we will talk briefly about some of them. Namco released Gapless, the daunting sequel to Galaga. Rebranded as Galaga 3 in the US to ensure recognition, it revolutionized the fixed shooter by allowing vertical movement. Crucially, it flipped the script on the tractor beam. Players could now capture enemies, forming a destructive 6-ship armada. Faster, darker, and significantly harder than its predecessor, Gapless intimidated casual players. Yet, for hardcore fans, this aggressive upgrade transformed Galaga's polite dueling into an all-out war. Also, Namco turned a generic Xevious enemy into the star of Grobda. Designed by Masanobu Endo, this fixed arena shooter was a chaotic prequel to modern battle royales. Gameplay relied on a high-stakes shield mechanic. Players were invincible but became vulnerable the moment they fired. The real draw was the chain reactions. Destroying one tank triggered massive explosions that could wipe out the screen. Fast, loud, and punishing, Grobda was Endo's explosive gift to hardcore Twitch gamers. Jordan Mechner's Karateka brought cinema to the Apple II. Using rotoscoping, Mechner gave characters unprecedented fluidity and weight, making them feel human. He revolutionized storytelling by introducing cinematic cutscenes and cross-cutting editing to build suspense. The gameplay demanded discipline, punishing aggression. Players even had to bow to enemies. In a famous final twist, approaching the princess while still in a fighting stance resulted in instant death, teaching players that true heroes must know when to lower their fists. Ultimate Play the Game conquered Britain with Saberwolf. Arriving in premium packaging, this blockbuster featured a massive, vibrant 256-screen jungle maze. The gameplay mixed exploration with terror. Lingering too long summoned the invincible wolf, forcing players to keep moving. Strategically, the Stamper brothers delayed their 3D revolution, Nightlore, to let this 2D masterpiece shine. The gamble paid off, making Saberwolf the Spectrum's best-selling game of the year and the definitive last hurrah for 2D gaming. David Crane defied the aging Atari 2600's limitations with Pitfall 2: Lost Caverns. Using a custom DPC chip inside the cartridge, Crane achieved the impossible: smooth multi-directional scrolling and complex dynamic 4-channel music. He revolutionized gameplay by removing the game over screen, introducing infinite lives and checkpoints to prioritize exploration over reflexes. As the console's technical swan song, Pitfall 2 proved the hardware still had secrets, delivering the first true home adventure just as the industry crashed. Nintendo utilized surplus monitors to create the dual-screen arcade giant Punch-Out! Featuring a practical green wireframe protagonist, the game shifted the perspective directly behind the player. It wasn't a button masher, but a rhythm puzzle. Players had to read visual tells to dodge and counter iconic villains like Glass Joe and Bald Bull. With crystal-clear digitized voice acting and distinct character personalities, Punch-Out! Revitalized Nintendo's arcade presence, proving that simple controls and great timing could deliver a knockout punch. Finally, Nintendo's VS Ice Climber challenged players to scale 32 icy mountains vertically. Armed with mallets to shatter ceilings, players navigated a punishing physics engine where slippery traction made every jump a calculated risk. The game's true legacy, however, lies in its chaotic two-player mode. While ostensibly cooperative, the camera only followed the leader, killing anyone left behind. This turned the climb into a cutthroat race, inventing competitive griefing and cementing Ice Climber as a notorious friendship-ruining classic. If you look at the timeline of technology, usually you see slow, steady evolution. But 1984 was different. We went from the simple mazes of Pac-Man to the infinite galaxy of Elite. We went from the flashing lights of the arcade to the mouse-driven desktop of the Macintosh. We saw the birth of the fighting game, the real-time strategy game, and the sandbox adventure. The crash of 1983 didn't kill the industry. It just cleared the forest so new trees could grow. Every modern PC, every smartphone interface, and every open-world game we play today can trace its DNA back to the risks taken in the single chaotic year. 1984 didn't look like a dystopia. It looked like the future.